Thank you. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the work of Dr. Verna St. Denis and Dr. Carol Schick, both anti-racist educators whose teachings have really helped lay the foundation for all of my own social justice work. I won't give too much background on spoken word poetry because I know, thankfully, that more and more people are becoming familiar with this genre. But for those of you who aren't, I just want you to imagine poetry that is spoken out loud, that is performed rather than read or recited. To give any other definition would be to limit what has become an extremely diverse genre and one that has at its foundation a goal of being accessible to all people and all voices. Of course, it has yet to gain much currency in academic circles, but few spoken word artists are complaining. See, Mark Smith, who founded the modern-day poetry slam movement, actually said that he intended to circumvent academics with this new idea that regular people would meet in, crowded bars and cafes and speak poetry, their own poetry, to each other. You see, because somewhere along the way, this idea that poetry was meant to be spoken was lost. And libraries at home and the public library became places for poetry. And perhaps there is something to be said for curling up with one's favorite poem and letting its imagery just wash over you in silence. But there's another way to experience poetry, one that more and more young people and more people from marginalized backgrounds are flocking to and promoting, and it's called spoken word. And it's nothing new, only resurrected. Given the quiet poetry status quo, spoken word becomes a means of queering things. That is to say, a means of being something out of the ordinary, a means of challenging that which is dominant and considered normal. Therefore, the genre itself is a means of queering things, and in that way is performative of so much of its content, so many of its messages, and so many of its voices. A simple YouTube search will reveal a plethora of spoken word artists from marginalized backgrounds, decrying the ills of oppression that have so obtrusively characterized their experiences in this Canada. This Canada which the dominant narrative touts as so tolerant, as if that were enough. And of course, it's not enough, we know that. But we rarely hear it. And we rarely hear it because sometimes in this country we're so caught up in celebrating our diversity that we disallow discussions of race and racism to take place in venues that are public or mainstream. So I would argue that spoken word becomes a place where a critique of these systems is allowed. Partly because spoken word venues permit that critique and in some cases even favor it, but also because the self-exploratory process of writing allows one to look at disadvantage and to say, what's causing this? It's unfair to have a gag order on racism and on classism, homophobia, sexism, because it means that those who suffer oppression have to do so quietly, privately, perhaps through tormented poetry scribbled in journals that will then be locked and never shared. And that's not fair. It wasn't fair to me growing up. See, I didn't discover spoken word poetry until I was out of high school. And that's what I want to change for future generations, and I'll tell you why. I believe there are 4 extremely positive benefits to engaging with spoken word poetry in the pursuit of social justice. The first one is healing. See, one of the most troubling characteristics of oppression, in my eyes, has always been that without an informed critical analysis, those who suffer disadvantage must do so privately. And like I said, that's not fair. It's not fair to not know the source of one's disadvantage. But with the self-exploratory process of writing, we can look at it in a new light and ask the question, what's causing this? That's a question that scares a lot of Canadians, but one that, if answered, can quell the anxious fear of not knowing on the other side of difference, the fear of not knowing why one feels so inferior all of the time. Patrick Kamanjian says that spoken word poetry is indeed a viable outlet for youth, especially to articulate these difficult social realities. And with that articulation comes a new awareness of oppression, a conscientization of oppression that allows one to feel a sense of liberation from the system. Because at least now you can name it. You can name the source of your disadvantage, and by naming it, you can help others to see it and help others to feel a sense of liberation as well. That's healing. The second positive outcome that I've witnessed with spoken word poetry is empowerment. I alluded earlier to the fact that I believe poetry was always meant to be spoken out loud. And that notion, of course, sits in a much older and much richer tradition of oratory existing in indigenous cultures across the globe. So a part of what is so empowering about spoken word, I believe, is remembering these oral traditions, remembering our ancient legacy. And by reclaiming these traditions, I would argue that we're not just reclaiming an old medium, but we're reclaiming our voices. Voices which have been silenced for too long. Voices which have been ignored for way too long. And see, it's difficult to ignore the shouts of the modern day poetry slam. Shouts which often cry, "We will not be ignored anymore." Right? And we witnessed this with the It Gets Better campaign, one which saw numerous spoken word poems of hope, of freedom, of protest, and of solidarity. And that's the third positive outcome, solidarity. Dictionary.com uses phrases like a community of feelings, common responsibilities to define it. And I would argue that responsibilities is indeed the operative word here. After all, what are our responsibilities as Canadians? Right? I think most of us would agree that one of them is to uphold a fair and just society. But what would we do if we heard hundreds of other Canadians shouting from the rooftops that there is not yet a fair and just society to be upheld? And if you want to hear that, just come to a local poetry slam. Spend some time on YouTube, because they've been saying it for a long time. But a lot of times we don't want to hear that stuff. Right? It's much more comfortable to think that each Canadian has it just as easy as the next. Sometimes we even say that they have it easier than we do. But Anne Bishop tells us that in order to truly become allies of the oppressed, those in positions of privilege must listen to them, listen to their stories, to their realities, which are often so different from those on the side of privilege. Atticus told us the same thing when he said that you can never really understand a person until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. And that can be uncomfortable. You know, climbing into the skin of a First Nations man, the skin of a lesbian, the skin of a person with a disability. It can be uncomfortable if we're not used to those realities. But I would argue, and what others have argued, is that without that discomfort, we cannot reach or achieve change, which is the final and most important outcome, positive outcome of using poetry, this spoken word, for social justice. Gil Scott-Heron famously noted that the revolution would not be televised, that we would not be able to skip out for beer during commercials. And in explaining this, he later said that he wanted people to understand if we were to see social change, that it would have to happen first at an invisible level, because it would have to happen first right here in people's minds. I want to reiterate that, but also to say that if we are going to see change and change our minds, we must first be challenged to do so by people like Gil Scott-Heron, by people like the hundreds of Canadian poets from marginalized backgrounds and all of their allies. We must first be challenged to change our minds through some sense of discomfort or discord. After all, if the purpose of an anti-racist poem is to make us feel what racism is like, it cannot and must not be comfortable. So who will take the challenge? Right? To be uncomfortable for 3 minutes during a spoken word poem. To listen with an open ear and open mind. Who will take the challenge to possibly change themselves? And who will take the responsibility that comes with the new knowledge of oppression to change it, change the system, change the world? I really believe in that change. And I believe it can start by us speaking our poems to each other, speaking our truths to each other, and by really listening. And that's why I want to end today with a poem, one in which I remember my people, my tradition, and my truth. And I invite you to listen, to climb into my skin, walk around, and look around with new eyes. This lady once told me that I was lucky because black people don't age. And it's true that my grandmother bore the beauty of youth. But I wonder, do our faces not wrinkle because we bear the facelift of too much pulled hair? Or because our expressions have been frozen with the shock of rape? See, at times at the altar, I fall and I wonder how our bodies have been altered. By the passing of ships over bodies of water. By the lashing of whips over bodies of brothers. How our lips are enlarged from too many hits till they say we look like monkeys. Till they say we talk funny. But it's really because right here, education comes from money. So I diss the disproportionate spread of wealth. So I am diabetic from the disproportionate spread of health. So the way I get rich is fist over hand, clinging to ancestral ideals of wealth in distant lands. And it is true, we must deal with the dealing of hands. Hands with white palms, worn from all that church clapping that once ran from Christians who were chasing and trapping, that once clung to a palm like life clings to a sapling, hoping not to get taken by the brand new colonial exploitation, exploration, domination, subjugation, the commodifying, uninspiring, anti-integration. Call me African Canadian. See, my story lies in too many tombs where I have searched for my sons and daughters. My story lies in too many moonrises spent waiting these cracked feet in water. My story lies in the brands blazed and the scars raised on my skin like a relief map. See, they labeled me black and then they labeled my back, so everywhere I lie, I leave a legacy of lines like a fingerprint. That's where my story resides. It's in those 40 lines, like 40 acres I'm owed, where 40 trees might grow from the seeds that were sowed. My story is in hope. My story is a ghost of Kunta Kinte. My story is in the ghost of Billie Holiday. See, my ancestors hang from my family tree. Like strange fruit for the crows to pluck. If black people don't age, I wouldn't call it luck. Thank you.